Over the past few weeks, my nightmares have featured AI agents and post-install scripts. So what I'm seeing in real life right now is a mix of those two updates to Gemini CLI and run the Gemini CLI trust model due to a 10.0 CVSS CVE in Gemini CLI. My two worst nightmares have come together in real life, and I'm not sure how to feel about it. Let me be crystal clear. I believe that using AI to do PR code review is actually a very good thing. Using an AI-powered tool to check PRs and summarize the changes is actually a really good way to lower how much debt people need to handle. But if you use those tools the wrong way, or if those tools have a vulnerability, that's where the whole castle comes tumbling down. For instance, large company Red Hat is actively using a workflow right now that uses Gemini to review PRs. Submitting a pull request is usually a good thing. But what if there's a vulnerability inside of Gemini? To run a pull request in CI by the end of the day, you need to be using the Gemini CLI or the Run Gemini CLI workflow that already exists. The issue with these is to use them in headless mode so you can use them as intended. During a CI/CD deployment, they have to run in YOLO mode. YOLO mode is basically the mode that lets you run arbitrary commands on the system, which is exactly by design when running Gemini CLI in CI/CD, it needs to operate this way. This means the CLI can run any tooling you want, as long as you specifically turn on -YOLO. But what happens if your pull request includes a malicious Gemini settings.json is actually a very common scenario, a pretty harmless JSON file that sets up your agent to switch into Vim mode. Perhaps you're opting for the GitHub theme just because you hate yourself. Maybe you want to run a set of tools inside the Docker sandbox. Whoa, the tools option lets you run in a sandbox, that's awesome. But in classic tooling style, there's a hook, and the hook comes in different forms. One happens before the tool, while the other happens before the agent, which means after the user submits the prompt. But before planning, before any AI agent runs, it will execute a before agent hook. That hook can also be a command. It might be a command name security check that runs any command on the system arbitrarily, which is totally okay if you, as the code author, you're the one creating the command. But here's the main problem with a pull request. Guess who actually controls the code you potentially use? But even more so, the hacker, right? The bad guy is running the code. So what could happen again before they patch this flaw? Is a hacker might submit a bad pull request, and then a GitHub workflow would trigger. And again, this is literally just Red Hat. I'm using them as an example because they didn't get hacked. I'm just showing you that workflows like this do exist. You can send in a pull request. The pull request workflow and the Gemini PR review will run. And once more, this is on a pull request target if they get opened. So it'll run on open and then it'll trigger the PR pull request review using Gemini. But the problem is that before this patch, you could execute any arbitrary commands inside the context of Gemini. Settings.json, which would execute inside the CI/CD runner as the organization. So if you can get arbitrary code execution on the CI or CD runner, you could potentially steal their tokens and API keys. Anything that was alive inside the environment your payload was running in now. Nightmares, let's discuss Team PCP. If you don't know, Team PCP is the threat actor behind most of the large-scale supply chain attacks that have been going on for the past few months. These include light LLMs. These include tools for trivia. This includes ChalXMarks, which is a software composition analysis tool, right? A software security tool, and apparently TLNix, which is another one I've never heard of. It all originally came from some CI/CD compromise, right? It's this weird pattern where companies are using good development tooling, they're implementing solid security practices, and because they're doing that, a wrong assumption about how we're using them is creating huge downstream effects. Now, I'm not saying that this tool is the reason why these exploits happened. I'm not claiming Team PCP took advantage of a bug in Gemini CLI. That's not what I'm saying at all. The thing I'm saying is this reliance on CI or CD, which probably now includes AI tooling with settings files that aren't properly sanitized. This is a big scale pattern we're seeing that could be letting actors pull off this kind of compromise. That's correct. All these hacks involve a compromised CI or CD pipeline, or the use of a compromised CI/CD action, right? I think the trivia action got compromised, which led to the light LLM being compromised as well, for example. Or I think the Axios compromise, specifically the compromise of the Axios workflow, was already done, since Axios relied on the Checksmarks tool behind the scenes in March of this year. Team PCP took advantage of an attack that took benefit of an ACAB OTS service that enabled them to compromise the Trivia AJAME repository. That March, Team PCP compromised the Aqua Security Trivia by exploiting a vulnerability in their system. They compromised the GitHub action used in KIS and AST, which eventually caused downstream effects. Right now, it's super important to point out that the way CI or CD runs under the hood is when a payload gets executed. The CI/CD needs a runner to execute it. Now, a lot of the runners are run by GitHub, right? By default, when you run a workflow in GitHub, you use a GitHub hosted runner. But it's also pretty common for big companies or firms that want to have something like that run on the runner to launch a self-hosted runner. Your local binary on the infrastructure will grab the payload and pull it down and run the workflow for you, right? This is something people do all the time these days. This is an issue again because you're building your workflow based on what's executing inside your runners. Is trusted, and they exploit this kind of Gemini CLI bug now to get code execution in your runner. If you fail to properly secure the data or reveal trusted data inside those runners, you're in for a rough time since your API keys might get picked up. Your environment variables for other processes running at the same privilege level that hold things like database credentials or API credentials could also get compromised. And if you're watching this, you're probably wondering, what do I do? So this is what you're saying? How do I handle this supply chain attack pattern in Gemini CLI? And possibly other tools being used in this manner that a threat actor could exploit when they're pulling. Ask, correct? In the end, I believe the only right move is to assume everything's been breached, correct? Assume that what you're doing is going to lead to a compromise in some capacity. And as a result, if someone ended up in a spot like your local GitHub runner, or if someone ends up in your pull request environment, which is maybe cloud hosted, how could that result in even more to compromise? But if you're running a self-hosted runner, do you have any interesting credentials or secrets exposed in other running processes at the same level as that runner? If that's the situation, use the Linux user scheme, use the Linux permission model, and create new users for those processes. So they probably can't run forever, meaning they can't keep running and stealing your credentials. Also use proper sandboxing. I'm hoping that if you're using self-hosted runners, you're also using Docker or something similar that stops a compromise from leaking outside that local. Basically, the crude jail Docker sets up. If you're running Docker containers as root, that's a whole other conversation we need to have about you not doing that tomorrow. But in the end, that's the direction this takes, right? Act like everything is compromised. If something gets compromised, what are you going to do about it? Also worth noting that Google submitted mitigations for this. It looks like they added a new flag so that Gemini Trust Workspace isn't turned on by default. So if your workspace really does run solely on PRs from trusted collaborators, you can turn on Gemini Trust Workspace, bada bing, bada boom, and everything's fine. Otherwise, you need to use the new version of the Google GitHub Actions Run Gemini Clean Workflow that the versions 3.9.1 and 40.0.0 preview. 3 basically don't trust the workflow settings by default. You might need to update it because some folks pin specifically to a certain Gemini CLI version. You need to pin in order to actually get the new version because all the versions before these were affected by this, which is worthy. So yeah, definitely update your CC the workflows if you haven't already. Anyway, guys, that's all for now. Thanks, Badek. Thanks for watching. Hello, B. De Morgan. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button. I really appreciate it. And then head over to this other video about a similar supply chain attack that I think you'll enjoy. We'll see. You over there, take care.